Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center, and we are so pleased to welcome you today to the first event in our new global headquarters here in Washington, D.C., and it's for the launch of our special report in partnership with Rhodium Group, G20, Avoiding Entanglement, an Escalation Crisis in the Taiwan Strait. This is part of a trilogy of work we've done over the past 2 years looking at the economic parameters of a Taiwan Strait crisis. We started a year and a half ago looking at what would happen if the G7 were to sanction China over a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. We followed that with China's retaliation, and now we conclude with what would happen across the G20. This report is especially timely as it comes 1 week ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit in Brazil, where these issues will be discussed both publicly and privately in Rio de Janeiro. We are so pleased to partner with Rhodium Group on this research. We're going to dive into all the findings, talk about what it means, and talk about how it might impact the next administration, the Trump administration, as they come in January. I want to welcome in Matt Mingy, Associate Director at Rhodium Group. Matt, thank you for being here, co-author of the report. Thank you for all your research. Let's go into the key findings.
Thanks, Josh. One thing that we have focused on in this report, picking up from our prior work on the G7, is really expanding the lens to see how the G20, which contains very, very diverse economic profiles, will respond to a Taiwan crisis. And we focus in this report on 3 case countries, Brazil, South Korea, and Indonesia, as a window into how those responses might develop. One of the things that's interesting about the G20 is that unlike our previous work, which focused on intra-G7 alignment, the G20 will be trying to balance between competing camps, the US and G7, however aligned that it is, and China. As such, how the G20 and how our 3 case countries respond will depend on what those asks are. And that's the starting point of our research, looking at China's requests, US and G7 requests, and then exactly how China will go through implementing those requests. For each of these case countries and for the broader G20, it will then be a question of navigating trade-offs, political trade-offs, diplomatic trade-offs, economic trade-offs. And in the report, we take a look at all of these factors to divine how these countries are likely to respond in terms of aligning with the US and G7, aligning more with China, or, as we find in the report, trying to strike a balance between those 2 camps. We take a look at historical policy positions related to Taiwan, not an area of primary foreign policy focus for these countries, but still highly relevant. Past sanctions alignment with the US, as well as the UN international sanctions, especially focusing on practical constraints and practical benefits of these countries' relationships, economic and financial, with China. And especially in this report, we focus on how these countries may or may not have been exposed to economic statecraft. That's positive inducements, aid, loan flows, trade benefits, as well as negative economic coercion, especially South Korea, targeted by major economic sanctions and economic coercion in the 2010s. Lastly, we put it all together for each of these case countries and offer some cross-cutting takeaways, looking at where these countries are likely to accede, where they are likely to comply with either US or G7 or China's requests, the likely level of that compliance, but also with an eye towards the US and our previous work, where are we likely to see friction, where are we likely to see misalignment, and where are those trade-offs likely to be sharpest in these 3 case countries and the G20 as a whole.
And it's so important when we talk about these 3 countries, and it represents the G20 because there's such a wide variance in terms of economic interdependencies, political interdependencies. We think of a BRICS country like Brazil. We think of a country like South Korea, which has been far more aligned with the G7 when it comes to Russia. And that's why we chose those 3, to show different types of case studies and represent the wide range across the G20. So let's talk about the moderate and the high escalation scenario. And Matt, if you can explain to everyone watching why we break it out this way, and how we think about the parameters of a crisis.
So it's important to note up top, as with our previous reports, we are focusing on less than conflict scenarios. We are not talking about kinetic conflict here. But it's important to distinguish between a moderate escalation scenario and a high escalation scenario because, while we don't want to focus too much on the likely triggers of a Taiwan escalation, some of the qualities of that escalation could impact conditions, global economic conditions, global financial conditions, and how these countries are incentivized to align one way or the other. In a moderate escalation scenario, we're talking about a provocative development entanglement perceived as provocative by China involving US or G7 policy towards Taiwan, short of diplomatic recognition, could be, for example, a very sizable arms sale and expansion arms sales. In a high escalation scenario, again, drawing on our previous framework, we're focused on a more comprehensive, more highly provocative G7 or US sanctions package. We focus in on the report, though, on what we consider to be more likely, which is the moderate escalation scenario. And in that scenario, we break down what the US and G7 response and the approach to the G20 will be, as well as China's approach to the G20. It's important to note that while the G7 has a tricky task in a Taiwan escalation scenario, even a moderate one, building consensus within the G7 and then moving towards the G20, looking for sanctions compliance, looking for supportive statements, China's priority in a moderate escalation scenario will be maintaining business as usual, and that will be primarily those asks. Potentially some seeking of statements of support, but really refraining from using those statecraft tools and relying on its existing economic influence. When you move to a high escalation scenario, the stakes get much higher. Consensus building becomes much more important for the US and G7, and questions of critical supply chains, questions of trying to disrupt trade in specific goods become a lot more acute, highly challenging, and there's a lot more pressure, especially on sanctions. Comparatively for China, we still think that even under a high escalation scenario, you're dealing with more complex requests, and the focus shifts simply from statements of support or business as usual to finding ways around potential G20 restrictive measures. So for example, changing the conduct or currency of settlement of trade, trying to find alternative financial and trade networks. These things become more important as you move down the conflict ladder.
And that's an area we study extensively at the Atlantic Council, the tools of circumvention, both through payment systems, cross-border settlement. We'll talk about that in our panel discussion. Digital assets play a role there as well. And the timing matters a lot in terms of what China's abilities are today versus what they might be 5 years from now, and the linkages with other countries. Let's talk about the linkages. We've just taken one data set here from each country. There's a lot more in the report. It's available online now at atlanticcouncil.org. Everyone can dig in. But Matt, just one from each, Brazil, South Korea, and Indonesia, and let's start with Brazil.
So there's no way for one chart to do justice to all the detail that we contain in the report, but it is very helpful for us to extract some of the main data points that we see as having major influence over how these countries will react in a Taiwan escalation scenario. Certainly for Brazil, we spend a lot of time breaking down the trade relationship, the extensive trade relationship between China and Brazil. It's worth noting, and we focus on it in the report, that Brazil is one of the few countries worldwide that runs a trade surplus with China, which will drastically impact China's leverage as well as Brazil's attempt to kind of weave through a Taiwan escalation scenario. Certainly, the challenge for Brazil is only getting more acute. Trying to manage BRICS political ties, the expansion of the BRICS bloc, as well as changes in terms of currency denomination. We see, we detail in the report, an increase in the amount of renminbi-denominated trade, but it's something that we find will have a major impact on Brazil's response, and we'll talk about it in a second, how Brazil will likely be pursuing business as usual. Compare that to South Korea, a country with a much different economic profile, certainly not a large commodity exporter, but has supply chains that are very, very tightly tied with China, as well as a large proportion of manufacturing by Korean firms located within China. We talk about in the report, you're talking about between 30 and 40% of China-Korea trade being intra-Korean firms. So it's not just Chinese firms exporting to Korea and vice versa. Korean firms have skin in the game on both sides of that border. At the same time, South Korea, as we note in the report, tricky political relationship, particularly with North Korea and the effects there in a Taiwan escalation, even a moderate escalation. Lastly, we talk about Indonesia. Certainly the focus for Indonesia has been on critical supply chains, has been on alternative supply chains for batteries, renewable energy, and China is a major, major contributor. We talk in the report about the major investments, as well as China as a export destination for many of Indonesia's critical minerals, as well as battery exports as they move up that supply chain. One thing that we break down in the report, though, is that while China is a major investor and a major player in that space, it is not the only one. Many of those high-profile investments, including in, for example, mineral refinery that are key to batteries, are co-investments with Indonesian investors, with international investors, including Japanese investors. Add to that the complex history of Indonesia's territorial claims in the South China Sea, and you have something that is less straightforward in terms of economic influence. even though China plays a very, very major role as an investor and trading partner. And all of that affects how we think these countries will align, and certainly in their incentives to ride through a moderate escalation scenario.
What I think is important about the entanglements issue is it's not just about G20 countries' entanglements with China, it's about their economic linkages with G7 countries and how those differ, for example, Indonesia and Japan. And that's what we look at in this report, because G7 unity, as our research and others have shown, would be critical in this situation, and that would be tested across the G20. So some of the key takeaways you saw on the economic statecraft side.
Well, one thing that you see in terms of reading the report and that we come to the conclusion of is that while these countries have very, very different economic profiles, very, very different past Taiwan policies, and very, very different sort of security exposures to China, the incentives all point in the same direction, and that is to riding it out, trying to balance between two camps. And whether you're talking about Brazil, South Korea, or Indonesia, you are unlikely to see, probably, strong alignment with one side or the other due to those economic ties between, for example, Brazil and Indonesia. South Korea, obviously a bit of an exception, obviously much closer relations, economic relations, political security relations with the G7, and you might see potentially increased compliance there. But there are caveats and there's a lot more nuance, for example. Brazil, you might see compliance with some of the lower end requests in a Taiwan escalation scenario, for example, customs compliance. And similarly with Indonesia, you might see some low-level compliance. At the same time, these countries, because of the economic balance between the G7 as well as with China, they will be attempting to navigate those and avoid siding with one or the other. What that means, for example, for Brazil, for South Korea, and for Indonesia is the question of loud compliance versus quiet compliance. And in the report, we talk about the strong possibility that we see for a country like Brazil. We have, through interviews as well as through our data, taken a look at their financial industry, and the indications there are that Brazil would comply with financial sanctions, that they wouldn't necessarily embrace it explicitly, and you could expect similar carve-outs. We've already seen this with South Korea in terms of its approach towards de-risking, and Indonesia as well. So the overall picture is one where much will depend on the circumstances as well as the degree of international alignment, the degree of international unity that will certainly change how Brazil, South Korea, and Indonesia respond. But you can expect a level of quiet compliance with US sanctions even as countries, in terms of their explicit actions, try and walk that path, walk that tightrope, and avoid adopting anything that would be seen as too provocative for either the G7 or for China.
And I just want to underscore this point here about financial sanctions and the likelihood of compliance given the interlinkages of the banking sector and the need to invoice in dollars and otherwise. You only need to look at how the Chinese banking system has largely complied with G7 sanctions on Russia to understand that any country will have to try as much as possible to comply with the sanctions regime. And that's why, as you point out in the report, and we show, it's the export controls and the trade restriction side which seem much more relevant than the financial sanction side. Overall takeaways, Matt, before we wrap up.
Well, it's worth noting that no one knows, and we can't say exactly how Taiwan escalation scenario plays out. So many of these factors are based upon the data that we have, and that certainly there would be nuances that we don't capture in the report. But the data and our interviews can tell us a lot. What we see is that Beijing will have a limited interest in expanding the toolkit to deploy coercive economic statecraft against, for example, Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, partially because of its historical practice, but also because it has sufficient economic leverage, as we detail in the report, to incentivize those countries to refrain from statements of support for Taiwan, or at the very least to maintain business as usual. Instead, what you would see is that slow build-out of alternative economic and financial networks, and hopefully trying to, where it can, encourage those countries to avoid aligning explicitly with the G7. China has a lot at stake in a Taiwan escalation scenario. It will certainly feel that it has more to ask in terms of normative compliance, for example, of Brazil. And so that challenge will be for Brazil, South Korea, and Indonesia and the G20 to try and walk that tightrope. One of the things that also emerges in the report is the question of trade-offs for each of these case countries and the broader G20. The story of China's economic influence is usually seen as one of just straight trade balances, straight investment amounts. China's leverage goes beyond just that core data. It includes supply chains, as we detail in the report. And if you look at Indonesia, for example, or South Korea, the question of geographic proximity is going to complicate these responses. That said, in a Taiwan escalation scenario, much will depend then on other trade-offs. What do global economic and financial markets, what will they be telling these countries, and how will they have to respond? As well as what happens over time. Josh, your point about, for example, adapting to sort of Russian financial controls. That was not instantaneous, and you will see probably changes to these trade-offs and how they're navigated over time, even over a period of months or years. And lastly, the question of alignment. We do see that, for example, Brazil's financial markets or South Korea, that you would see some actors looking to comply with US sanctions, even if that compliance is quiet. And you will also try and see these countries move cautiously, certainly initially. That said, certainly after last week and the possibility of increased US trade restrictions coming under a Trump administration could threaten this country calculus. And there's going to be a lot that's going to be emerging in the next few weeks and few months that would potentially drastically affect how these countries would move.
Well, Matt, that's a good note to end on because this is, as our colleagues have said, a multidimensional game that changes in real time, and this is now a new wrinkle in the game in terms of the potential for tariffs and how that impacts economic interlinkages. Matt, I want to thank you, Laura, Logan, everyone who's contributed so much to this report at Rhodium Group. Thank you for your fantastic partnership.
Our pleasure.
I want to welcome up our distinguished panelists to the stage so we can unpack everything in the report. Please join me in welcoming Emily Kilcrease, Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS, and Logan Wright, Partner and Director at Rhodium Group for China Markets. Emily, Logan, welcome to the new Atlantic Council.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Thanks,
nice
Josh.
to be here.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for helping us inaugurate the new building. A timely topic and one we've been working on together for years. And I think it's important to say when we have this conversation, as we've talked about, none of us really wants to be thinking about this. We understand the costs are huge to the global economy. And when you think about escalation scenarios, you're not only thinking about markets, you're thinking about lives at risk here. On the other hand, given what we've all lived through in the past few years, especially with Russia, Ukraine, we understand this kind of work is important because the impacts are real and they are plausible, even if we hope it's a situation we never come across. And Emily, I want to turn to you first because you've been doing work in parallel to ours, looking at a different range of countries. And I wanted to see how the report landed with you, where it aligns with some of your findings and where it might differ.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, and congratulations to the Atlantic Council and Rhodium teams for a really excellent contribution to this policy debate. I think it's well received, and particularly the focus on the G20 is quite important. I think one of the hard lessons we learned going through the Russia sanctions context is that there wasn't enough attention paid on this grouping of countries from the outset. Not even thinking about trying to get them to align, but just thinking about the collateral damage that their economies are going to feel from any sort of large-scale sanctions effort, and making sure that there is a concerted effort to understand what those impacts are and engage with these countries more proactively to avoid some serious harms to their economies. That was just Russia. I mean, when you think about the potential China sanctions or economic statecraft conflict, the issues will be magnified just because of China's role in the global economy and their own deep linkages, as you've shown well in the report. Different varieties of linkages, and it very much depends on the country, of course. But there's going to be more hurt that comes out of that scenario. So, great contribution. At CNAS, we've been looking at similar issues, and I think when you start to put the puzzle pieces together, it's starting to form a picture of, what the global outlook would be for any sort of sanctions coalition, or just generally how the world would respond to a sanctions conflict between the United States and China. And there's some parallels with what we found, and I think some points of difference just based on the different countries that we focused on. I think the point about this quiet compliance is really important. So in our work, we've looked at a range of financial centers outside of the G7, and I think what we consistently find there is that the private sector is going to have a strong interest to comply, particularly private sector banks. There is still a huge incentive for them to not get in the crosshairs of US sanctions. And that's true even in the absence of direct government imposition of parallel sanctions. I think it raises some interesting questions about transshipment and enforcement and how leaky those sanctions will be, but nonetheless, there's a protective benefit that you get from those private sector incentives to comply, and I think that could potentially be intensified if the United States is willing to use secondary sanction tools and the like as you go higher up the escalation ladder. Some other points that I think came out of our research that are worth mentioning, and we looked at countries that I think were a little bit closer aligned to the US, but still outside kind of the G7 bubble. It's highly context dependent in terms of how they're going to align with the US or G7. And we heard that constantly in our research and our interviews and our international travel, was that whose fault is this? Whose fault is the conflict? And that's going to matter significantly. If this is really a Chinese provocation, if it's a clear violation of Taiwan's democratic institutions, that's going to matter a lot. If, on the other hand, the trigger is something provocative that the US did or something provocative that the Taiwanese government did, then that's really going to temper any sort of enthusiasm for coming into any sort of sanctions coalition. There's also, of course, the outstanding question of whether the US military is going to get engaged. We heard that come up a lot, right? So, I mean, as you have, we have also focused our research on pre-conflict type scenarios, because I think that's where the economic statecraft tools can be most helpful. But even in that period, the signaling around whether there's going to be US or G7, or maybe that's not the right grouping when you're talking about the military, but you get my point,
Yeah.
kind of military engagement, that's going to be important as well in terms of how committed is the United States to this particular battle. So I think maybe just some more nuance as we think about a broader range of countries, but overall I think what we're finding is very similar to what you guys are finding in terms of most countries in the world are going to try to walk this line very, very carefully, and the overwhelming response is going to be, please keep us out of it.
It's such an important point about what instigates the crisis and how that's perceived. We always, because of the nature of our work, have to assume things are more black and white than they will be in reality. And there will be a debate in the media ecosystem, Chinese propaganda as well, about what instigated a situation. And different countries will hang their hat on different rationales in that gray area of what escalated. And that makes it all the more complicated to achieve alignment. So thank you for raising that. We've heard that as well in our meetings. And not only across G20 countries, but even within G7 member countries. I won't name any specifically. But Logan, I want to turn to you. We've now been in partnership, as I said, going on 2 years in this work. And taking a step back, I have our other 2 reports here. The first one we did, the G7 sanctions, then retaliation and resilience. What has jumped out to you? What has surprised you? Just some of your key takeaways from the body of work we've done, which we refer to as the trilogy.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Emily. And I think this is the difficulty in writing this report, because we're, as opposed to the first report, which was sort of laying out the economic costs of a potential, Taiwan scenario. And the second report is thinking about China's response to those economic costs and the statecraft tools that they can provide. And now we're 3 steps down sort of the scenario planning tree and trying to think about, how this might play out when we think about the reactions from G20 countries, which is absolutely vital, but it also becomes a lot more difficult to game plan all these scenarios and completely reinforce the point that Emily just made about the importance of this of the path we actually take to get into this dynamic. So just a few observations from all 3 reports, I think, that emerge. And a lot of this effort has really been about sort of the limits of statecraft tools and how they are very useful, but have to constantly be melded to more sustainable political objectives that countries can maintain. So sanctions more broadly, economic sanctions, have obviously become a far greater element of our consideration in economic policymaking and statecraft more broadly. Why is this? Obviously, it's because of the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, people are thinking about how this applies in other scenarios as well. And the fact that sanctions were applied and the lessons we take from them have then created new lessons that, that need to be learned for how we think about applying them to these scenarios. But, as many have pointed out, and as our work shows, you can't really think about the impact of sanctions without thinking about how they can be sustained politically. Sanctions are not a remedy to economic imbalances. They cannot dramatically change trade flows. There are limits to the enforcement of sanctions that fall well before there are feasible alternatives to their use, which means that you can have severe broad-based restrictions on trade flows that nonetheless will probably see alternatives emerge at the same time. So just a call, I think, throughout our work for when looking at these tools and thinking about their impact, you have to have a solid foundation on which you can sustain not only a political basis for them in the United States, where they're most often considered, but alignment throughout the G7 at the same time, that everyone's sort of on the same page about the economic costs and trade-offs therein. The second overarching lesson, I would say, is about the limits of China's own statecraft tools. China has a overarching trade surplus. That trade surplus is expanding throughout at this point because of the weakness of its domestic economy, because of its attempts to export over capacity. But therefore, surplus countries are more vulnerable to trade restrictions. At the same time, China's centrality within global supply chains gives them, important choke points over certain critical materials, certain intermediate goods, and their statecraft toolkit is very much limited within sort of the trade realm. If you look at what many people have discussed, the development of alternative renminbi-denominated financial networks, these are growing, fairly rapidly. They may continue to develop, but nonetheless, they're not going to be a remedy for these fundamental trade imbalances. No one, even if 100% of China's trade was denominated in renminbi, it wouldn't really provide the same degree of insulation from the global economy or an insulation from economic sanctions. And so the point is the imbalances matter, and how trade relationships develop matters as well. China's international renminbi internationalization efforts, its renminbi-denominated trade networks, can probably be used, as we discussed in the last report, as important offsets, as important safety valves against economic sanctions on certain critical materials. It is highly unlikely that they'll ever be used as a complete alternative to the dollar system, based on the nature of China's capital controls, the limits that they impose on the usage of the currency, and the fact that when there is financial stress, China often takes its own initiative to sort of limit the utility of renminbi-denominated financial networks, because it imposes additional pressure on the renminbi and creates additional balance of payments pressure. So just a broader point about all of these statecraft tools that we're studying, they do face very important limits, not only on the G7 side, but on the Chinese side. And then the final point, which I think this report makes very clear, more than some of the others, is exactly what Emily cited, which is the importance of how we get into this conflict and how that is perceived and how the scenario unfolds. There's a nice little discussion in this report about how in a moderate scenario, it's far easier, and Matt highlighted some of these points, it's far easier for countries to just comply with some of the Chinese asks, pretend that it's business as usual, try to stay out, and just argue that, well, this is basically, Taiwan is not a fundamental policy issue for us, so this isn't really, our overarching concern, and we'll continue trading as normal. And yet, when costs change, when there's a more severe set of sanctions imposed, that forces choices as well. And it arguably becomes the lower cost option to sort of comply with G7 and global sanctions. So the type of scenario matters quite a lot here, and there's an extensive discussion of that in the report. I already said too much, let me stop there.
No, that's great. Thanks, Logan. And I think, when I think back to our work, at the beginning when we started this, there were people who said, you can't sanction China in a Taiwan crisis, and there were people who said, of course you're going to sanction China in a Taiwan crisis. So what I always think has come out of our 3 reports now is the answer is it's complicated. Yeah. It's not yes or no. And we see, given, again, what we've lived through with Russia, Ukraine, the things you thought were impossible or you would never do, a situation changes and suddenly your toolkit has to adapt. And that's why we do this work. Emily, I want to pick up on something Logan said about China's response. So we understand countries will try to avoid entanglement. That's the whole premise of the paper. We understand some will quietly comply because they need to. China will likely not introduce punitive measures on those countries, as we outline in the report, because of the cost association. But what about the inducement side? Are there things China can do reaching out to countries in the G20 to say, look at how the US is making life more difficult for you. Here's how you should be deepening your relationship with us from what we would term a positive economic statecraft perspective?
Absolutely. I will say when we at CNAS game this out, actually run gaming exercises looking at this, that is almost always the first move that the China team does, because I think there is a recognition that their ability to attack on the economic statecraft side is limited for all the good reasons that Logan just outlined. It's going to be difficult for them to really go on the offensive. I think a lot of their measures are going to be based on shoring up their own economic situation in the face of intense sanctions pressure. And then the other strategy is the kind of the positive vision, right? Like they are going to lean on the fact that, or they're likely going to lean, I don't want to speak with any certainty here, lean on the fact that a lot of these countries in the G20 or more broadly, like their interest is to stay out of this. And so if they can add a sweetener to that, that makes all the much more sense for them to try to do. I think also, as China's thinking about its mitigation strategy, right? Like, how does it respond to G7 sanctions pressure? Part of the answer to that is going to be to find alternative partners. And it's going to have a range of partners around the world who are perfectly willing to continue any sort of trade that they can, consistent with the US and G7 sanctions regime, right? So they're going to have willing partners there. So I actually think, I mean, it's not true for every country in the G20, of course, but for a lot of these countries, I think there's going to be this very kind of receptive conversation that they can have with China about how to mitigate the damage. A lot of them don't believe in the legitimacy of US sanctions anyways, right? And so it's going to be a relatively easier conversation. And so in a lot of respects, they might not even need to explicitly threaten the negative side of the toolkit. Everybody knows it's there. A country like South Korea knows it's there, right? Like, they have the established practice of using these sorts of negative tools, but there's absolutely a play here where China can go out and say, we're being the responsible ones here. We want to maintain the integrity of the global financial system. By the way, this Taiwan stuff is none of anyone's business anyways. And so let's just all try to build relationships and build more positive economic relationships in the face of the US being ridiculous. I mean, I think that's a very plausible strategy.
And can I ask you one follow-up about the G7? We're talking about the G7 in a sort of monolithic way. The G7 will do this, the G7 will do that. Yeah. And I think we talk about it that way because in the Russia-Ukraine context, they really have, by and large, acted in unison. But in the China-Taiwan context, as your research has done, and by the way, if folks haven't read No Winners in This Game, your fantastic report, I want to direct them to it. But the US-European dynamic here, not even taking into account the Japanese dynamic, would be very different and could open up huge gaps in any economic statecraft response.
I mean, it's such an important point, right? That we talk about G7, I think, as analysts, because that's the unit you need to have working in concert in order for any sort of economic pressure strategy on a target as large and sophisticated as China to work, right? So we keep coming back to that, but you're right, it's kind of a rhetorical crutch. Because in reality, in some ways, the Ukraine crisis was unique. It was on Europe's doorstep. You know, when you talk to European counterparts, particularly in the early stages of that crisis, they're like, look, we have refugees coming in on train from, you know, a 3-hour train. Like, it felt very close to home. It feels very existential for Europe. But then the next thing they immediately tell you is that Taiwan doesn't feel like that for them. It's much more complicated. It's not that clear violation of international law, and China's strategy for coercing Taiwan is not going to give that clear boots over the border moment like what we had in Russia, Ukraine, right? And so I do think the splintering there is a much more realistic possibility. And then on top of all of those political considerations, you have the economic considerations, right? Like, you still have pretty significant corporations in, just for example, Germany, who are really committed to the China market, and it's been stymieing even like more mild de-risking efforts at this point, right? It's not to say that Europe hasn't moved on economic security issues more broadly. I think they have. I think they have a relatively good story to tell, but it's nowhere near the level of what you would need if you are actually genuinely concerned about this sort of kind of rupture over Taiwan.
No, and we've heard the same in our research, and the only thing that's added a dimension to that is sometimes when you talk to European counterparts, they think about it less in the Taiwan situation and more in, is it proven that China is providing lethal aid to Russia? Right. And then they feel like this triggers something more closer to home for them. But in a Taiwan-specific context, I completely agree with you. It feels removed, and the responses would likely be very different. But Logan, I want to turn on Taiwan because, you know, Emily brought up Ukraine and Ukraine's response and the way Zelensky rallied the world. Taiwan's agency matters here. What Taiwan wants matters, and it's not completely clear-cut given the economic, political, military consequences that they're facing, that things would play out in a similar fashion.
No, that's exactly right, and I think it's an underappreciated fact that throughout, you know, Taiwanese diplomacy for the last couple of decades, it's been that China wants to view Taiwan as a factor in the U.S.-China relationship. The U.S. and Taiwan generally want Taiwan to be a participant and a player within this relationship over time. And so the question is, you know, Taiwan is also going to have they have of course, a security relationship, you know, and dependence upon the United States. And at the same time, it's not at all, you know, obvious exactly how they respond in a situation in which Chinese goods are sanctioned and they are also facing economic retaliation against Taiwanese firms and their own components, because one assumes that if you're getting into one of the high escalation scenarios that we're discussing, that the damage to the Taiwanese economy is going to be considerable. And so, I think it's pretty obvious that Taiwan's move at that point would be to garner as much international support to liken their position to Ukraine, to Ukraine's position at the same time, and to create similar sort of analogies as they have been doing. And that effort has been a lot more successful, I think, for the Taiwanese over the last couple of years, ever since the Russian invasion, in making this analogy. Nonetheless, I mean, the actual level of the potential impact is still quite severe, and it would be something for, it's another element of this game that we haven't really, and I say game very loosely as we're thinking about sort of game theory concepts and tabletop exercises and putting this together. It's another element of this kind of scenario planning that is still, under theorized, if you will.
We're getting questions from the audience, and for those watching online or here, please use askac.org and submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. But Logan, could I just follow up and ask you to set the scene for us? This is something we've talked about privately in our discussions on this. We again approach this very analytically. There'll be an escalation, there'll be a response. What do you think the market reaction will be like in this 24, 48, 72 hours? Unclear what China's intentions are vis-a-vis Taiwan, the landscape at which this economic statecraft toolkit might need to be deployed against.
Yeah, and I think that that's changing as well as markets are becoming more used to economic statecraft tools being deployed. So the immediate response, if you had asked me that question in 2022, immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would say that you would get an immediate tightening of global dollar conditions and global dollar liquidity conditions, that people would assume that Chinese banks would face sanctions immediately, and therefore they would start withdrawing dollar lines to Chinese banks. That in turn, and there's a lot of literature out there, particularly for the Bank for International Settlements, that in turn would create this tightening of global trade conditions, a tightening of global trade finance that would likely require the Fed to intervene and to stabilize and counteract some of that pressure through extending dollar swap lines. So this would create this immediate uncertainty in global trade. I think the response now is a little bit different, precisely because many of these sanctions have already been deployed, and most people assume that you can't actually use exactly the same economic toolkit, that it is because of the damage it would create to global trade. So therefore, I think markets would look at this kind of like, is this going to escalate? Or is this a signal that is designed to, is this a provocative action designed to enable a negotiation or a resetting of the status quo? And the type of gray zone scenario matters quite a lot there in terms of what markets think China is willing to do. And the critical question for most people planning around this, for corporations, it's often about, does this look like something that's going to continue changing for the worse, and therefore are we in basically the domain of loss of potential market and market share of potential economic costs, and therefore I need to take measures now to avoid those costs? Or does this look contingent? Does this look like a different kind of measure designed to enable an outcome? And markets will immediately respond to the uncertainty, I think, by tightening global dollar conditions, by tightening global trade conditions, by creating new costs that weren't there before. But the ultimate resolution likely depends upon the next stage and what comes next, because you can, if I can speak very generally, I'm saying markets will respond this way. I don't know. No one who does. Everyone who does would probably be attacking me at this point. My point is, markets often seem to respond to a change in the range of expectations, not necessarily a change in the central tendency of what is happening at this point. And so, when that range of expectations shifts toward greater potential conflict, that's one thing. But you can easily envision a scenario in which people think that this is a crisis designed to basically tamp things down over a couple of years, and that could be a different response.
If you think this is complicated to do for us, just imagine the conversations that are going on inside the Fed, given what you just raised. And if you think they're not planning it, you haven't been paying attention, because they are aware of everything you just raised: dollar liquidity, swap lines. These contingencies have to be thought about, because they will have to step in some way. Emily, I want to turn to you on the G20. as we talked about, we launched this report specifically this week to get ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit next week. It will be President Biden's final G20 farewell tour in many ways for his career in international engagement and multilateralism. There's 2 months left in the administration. There's a lot to do. President Biden and President Xi will have presumably their final meeting together after knowing each other for at least 15 years, going back to Biden's time as vice president. If you were in the White House now, if you were advising, what would you target over the next 2 months vis-a-vis the China relationship or otherwise that you would try to make concrete gains are in the time left in office?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something I assume that the Biden team is actively working on. Obviously, if last week went differently and it was a Harris administration, it would be a fundamentally different conversation because it would be much more about a handoff. I think what they're worried about now and what they are likely focused on is securing wins on the China side where they feel like they have them. So in a lot of senses, it's going to be like tying up loose ends on unfinished business, right? So getting a little bit away from some of these sanctions contingencies, but certainly in the de-risking space, which is not unrelated, we've seen some of this already, right? Like we saw the final rule on outbound investment come out. I think they are trying to put their own stamp on some of these programs that may endure, right? Like there's things about outbound investment that are entirely consistent with incoming Trump administration's objectives. Scope may change, but otherwise I think directionally in the same kind of way. So I think that's a lot of what they're trying to do is like cement the legacy on how they handled the China relationship wherever they can. It's possible we'll see additional actions as they try to figure out like the end stage of the chips controls that we think are coming, maybe something additional on data security, right? Like there's a lot of things that have been in process for quite some time, and it would make a lot of sense for them to try to just lock it in. But whether they can do more than that, I think is kind of an open question, candidly. These sorts of transitions are always going to be inherently a little awkward, particularly for Biden personally at on the stage of something like the G20, right? Like he's in legacy building mode. He wants to convey his record, his role as an international leader, and he's got accomplishments to talk about, particularly when it comes to uniting the transatlantic alliance and really his investments domestic. Like there's a lot he wants to cement in that legacy, but at the same time, I suspect that most of the G20 leaders are going to be asking the question of, okay, well, what do we do on January 21st? And how do we actually manage this transition? And I think that's an open question about how much they're going to want to get into those conversations as opposed to just, kind of doing a victory lap on some of the international issues that Biden's been heavily invested in.
There'll only be so much they can say in response to those questions. And I was thinking about the G20, not just Biden's last G20, but we don't know what's going to happen with Chancellor Scholz. We don't know what's going to happen with Prime Minister Trudeau. I mean, there is a transition happening here in leadership across the G20. It could look very different next year when they reconvene in South Africa. But there's one issue everyone at the G20 is going to talk about: trade and tariffs. Not that the Biden administration will be able to signal one way or the other what will happen. But Logan, in our work, when we think about modeling, and Matt brought this up in the presentation, you're trying to look at the Chinese economy not as it is today, but as it is years from now, and that is shifting in real time because of the policies that may be implemented here in the US. How do you calculate that? How do you factor it in? How could that change some of what we say in the report?
Yeah, and we brought this up in the last report where one of the critical insights was how you envision the scenario in time depends on how you will envision the statecraft elements that can be deployed. So, 5 years from now, there will be a greater degree of de-risking and decoupling in global supply chains, which will reduce China's leverage within. They will still have choke points. They will still have some control over certain critical components, but there will broadly be a more diversified, base of manufacturing around the world. 5 years from now, China will also likely have a broader range of financial tools to respond and a more developed, global financial network in which they can circumvent sanctions. So the timing element really does matter here. Just the same way, the economic developments of the last 2 to 3 years in China are vitally important for, for how we think about China's toolkit and the global response. On the one hand, China's economy has weakened substantially in terms of domestic demand, which makes them a lot more dependent upon exports and the export of overcapacity in particular, and in particular to G20 economies, because it's far more likely that you will have trade restrictions in G7 economies, more broadly. On the other hand, their export base is more diversified. And so therefore, it actually requires greater alignment for the rest of the world with tariffs and trade restrictions if there's actually going to be a change in China's behavior rather than just the likely response, which is weakening the currency against the dollar and figuring out ways of transshipping, investing in third countries. I mean, just think about the level of Chinese investment in Vietnam, for example, that has occurred since the last round of tariffs in 2018 and 2019, and the level of third country transshipment that will test any enforcement of additional tariffs as well. So it's a call, I think, for the world needs a lot more alignment in terms of what the goals are of restructuring the global trade relationship if that's going to succeed, and that is a challenge for the new administration as well as maintaining that vis-a-vis the still considerable economic statecraft toolkit that China has at its disposal to slow that process down, to use its ties with the G20 economically that it already has to weaken those potential scope of alignment, and as Emily mentioned earlier, to offer sweeteners and other inducements within that process as well. So I think that's the next round of this entire process, and it's really an interesting one. The last thing I would say, there's probably not much China can do to slow or to stop the process of de-risking or decoupling, because much of this corporate investment that's occurring in third countries is now into new manufacturing centers is happening because of perceived national security risks and the way that China has acted during the COVID pandemic and growing its changing foreign policy behavior more broadly. But there is a lot it can do to moderate that process and slow it down, and to try to weaken international alignment.
Thanks. No, I think it's such an important point where you say about the exports, incredibly reliant on exports, but not solely to the US. So the multilateral alignment is really going to be the key in any kind of response, and that's what's so difficult.
Exactly. And obviously, if only the US raises tariffs, other countries will be concerned that they will then become dumping grounds for Chinese exports at the same time.
They've raised those concerns, as Brazil included.
And you already have tariffs going up, so yeah.
Emily, I want to get to a question here on semiconductors. It's amazing we've had a conversation about Chinese economic statecraft for 45 minutes and not raise semiconductors. But how do you see the semiconductor issue playing out? There was a way of thinking about it a few years ago of, well, of course you can't shut down trade in the Taiwan Strait, and look at the shock to the global economy, and look at what happened at TSMC. But I think that thinking, your work and others, has gotten a little more nuanced on the issue of how China would try to mitigate that situation if we were in a crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think the top line is still the same. I mean, any sort of disruption to the continued production of chips on Taiwan will be bad for the global economy and for the US economy specifically. Like, that top line still holds. Folks are probably familiar with some of the modeling work that Bloomberg has done, and our good friend Gerard DePippo, where you show overall economic disruptions from a Taiwan conflict. The vast majority of that is actually driven by disruptions to the chip supply chain, not just to the chips industry, but of course all of the downstream industries that rely on chips. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just about the cutting edge chips. Like, we could, if we all needed to, do without a new iPhone. I've had the same iPhone for 5 years. I would be fine, right? But people
are panicked, as you say.
People are panicked. Yeah, you can't do without those iPhones. But I think the underappreciated value of Taiwan's production capacity is actually their vast share in older node chips, right? That's just capacity that doesn't exist anywhere else. And I think the CHIPS Act investments in the United States are a great idea to try to mitigate some of that risk. Open question on whether any of them will be successful. Open question on whether our national champion Intel is going to be able to get to the cutting edge or even be able to produce that capacity. But even if CHIPS Act investments are wildly successful, I think that defrays some of the risk, but it doesn't eliminate the risk. Like, Taiwan's production capacity for chips is always going to, at least in the next decade, I would say, remain critical to the continued functioning of the global economy. So then what happens if there is a crisis or an actual conflict, right? I mean, a lot of that is going to depend on how China decides it wants to engage in the act of coercion, or if there's a conflict, how it actually wants to conduct that conflict. We've been looking at a range of scenarios trying to assess kind of what the drivers of impact would be. And it's actually quite hard to see how there would be any sort of overt coercive act like an embargo or actual kinetic conflict that doesn't have an impact on the island's productive capacity. When you're talking about shipments in and off the island, just basic utilities, electricity, water, these chip fabs need ultra pure water in order to make these chips. Like, it's a highly complex, highly sensitive operation that can be easily disrupted. And then it's a question of for how long, right? If you turn a fab off, you can't just turn the fab back on the next day and have it work, right? Like, it's a months-long process at best.
We've debated this in some of the sessions of
That's
how long
right.
it would take.
Yes. But it's not immediate, right? I mean, and so there will be ripple effects. But then if you're actually talking about a protracted conflict where all of a sudden you have Taiwan's, I mean, this is worst case scenario, and hopefully we never get to this, just to be clear about that, right? But if you have that sort of protracted conflict where you just have no chips coming off that island for 2 years or something like that, I mean, I think we haven't even started to really contemplate the damage that would do to the US economy, just because we're not going to have those chips, you're not going to have new cars, you're not going to have new electronics, all this lovely Zooming and video conferencing that we do. All of these functions that we've gotten so used to in our modern life is going to be slowed, and there's going to be a lot more friction because of that.
In a storm that China is probably more prepared to weather than the US, although it would shock everyone in some way, shape, or form. But the tolerance may be different.
I think that's exactly the point. If China decides to embark on this, there will be an assessment that they can take that sort of pressure, that pain to their own economy in a way that the US just might not be willing to. Yeah.
So Logan, there's a question here on Brazil, one of our case studies. We were in Rio a few months ago at the Finance Ministers Summit, and it came up in several of our conversations, and this is what the question gets at. We're talking about avoiding entanglement, avoiding the worst case scenarios, countries just trying to keep doing what they're doing and keep business open. But what about taking advantage of a crisis in some way, shape, or form? Meaning, does it open up channels for a country like Brazil to find new partners or increase engagement with partners if there's some really US-China friction?
I mean, I think that is certainly a possibility. I mean, Brazil is in a unique position vis-a-vis their trade with China in that the financial relationship in terms of renminbi-denominated trade is fairly new. The trade relationship is still very commodity intensive, but that also provides Brazil with a lot of leverage over Chinese asks at the same time. So in the event that you're talking about sort of broadening that, yeah, you can probably find alternative markets for critical commodities. It's an easier sort of trade relationship for Brazil versus other countries to diversify, and those linkages, I mean, obviously there's a lot of path dependence that comes into this, but there are more potential channels for diversification of that relationship than before. I think it's also advantageous in that you can ask for some of these inducements, sort of from both sides, depending upon your actions. You have more agency among countries that are sort of have important feed and interest in both camps. That becomes, I think, a lot more difficult when the implications become starker, when the costs rise. It's a lot easier, I think, to do it in these sort of moderate scenarios where you're just trying to say, yeah, we're trying to stay out of this and avoid any intentional provocation, but there are also things that would make that easier for us at the same time. And in a way, China has a bit of an advantage with their existing relationship because of that, the broad number of interests in Brazil, for example, with a strong political interest in maintaining the existing trade relationship, because all China really has to ask for is that you keep doing exactly what you're doing, that you don't really change anything dramatically.
And this is how a country like Brazil could take advantage of. We talked about China's positive inducements, Emily, but what about the US and the G7 positive inducements? Outside of the coercive, this is compliance, this is not, are there things the West can be doing to these countries to say, okay, we understand there's going to be some economic fallout of these. Here's how we can help you mitigate. I feel like that part of the conversation is always, oh yeah, maybe that's a good idea to think about. And then everyone nods and says, yeah, that's a good idea. But we don't dive into what it would actually look like.
I think it's a great point, right? I mean, it needs to be more of a central focus, not an afterthought on this, because for all the reasons that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes or so, right? There's just going to be more disruption. And I think one of the things that we've been emphasizing in some of our research and recommendations is governments need to do this planning now. I mean, we're never going to have perfect certainty. It's a highly dynamic situation, so many variables. But But that doesn't mean you just don't try to think about it at all, right? You need to actually do some of this gaming out to kind of anticipate what some of these impacts would be and think about how do you bring, for example, development finance into the conversation of there's going to be an impact here and we're going to flow some financing and investment into that space. You know, we really need to be thinking about this de-risking conversation in a much broader sense. Like, it's not, obviously the priority is always going to be de-risking around the US and our own economy, and that is rightly the priority. But if we are genuinely concerned about a Taiwan conflict and we can appreciate that it's really going to be, from the economic consequences, global in scale, right? Like, you're talking about disruption of global markets. We're going to be poking things in ways that are going to respond in ways that we just cannot fully anticipate, particularly if you get financial sanctions in the game, right? Then we do need to start thinking about having the toolkit available, right? Like, understanding from a strategic perspective what those disruptions likely are going to be and how China's going to respond to that, right? Like, it's not just going to be these countries sitting on the sideline, like, waiting politely for the US to come to their aid. Like, it is going to be a very intense, I think, bargaining process. Who's going to do me, like, who's going to be better for my economy in this highly contested, highly fragile environment, and how am I going to get my own economy through this, and is it going to be the US or China? And if we don't have those conversations now, if we don't have the toolkit now, if we don't have the financial instruments, the whatever it is, in place ahead of time, there's just going to be no bandwidth to actually do this in the moment, right? Like, when you think about just the massive surge capacity that both the government and the private sector had to do just to comply with Russia's sanctions, right? You hear from a lot of them that they're already completely tapped out. And then it's just going to be exponentially larger, right? So if we don't do that advanced planning, it's going to continue to remain an afterthought.
I mean, it's so important because I think of, you know, IMF, World Bank, leveraging some of those tools, but it takes years, these facilities, to do the lending, and this will have a geopolitical dimension to it. It's not the pandemic, so there will be tensions within these institutions. So if you want to do it, you have to start the work now and figure out, it's not something that could be stood up overnight.
Yeah, and just one other point adding to, completely agree with everything Emily just said, but just one other point adding to that, the current pattern of global trade is, you know, highly, you know, unhealthy in terms of this expansion of China's excess of overcapacity exports to developing economies in ways that are, you know, not necessarily conducive to long-term development within, you know, within developing countries right now. You know, there need to be steps to actively reverse that. You have to actually, if you're thinking about de-risking, decoupling, and breaking and changing patterns of global trade, you need active market access provisions. You need to start bringing into you know, the conventional literature, a joining of trade and security policy in ways that people haven't. It's a dirty word around this town, but it's ways that people are going to have to think about one way or the other. And I think the point I would make is that you can't just assume that that's going to develop on its own, because the current development is actually, you know, and Brad Setzer's made this point, it's an unhealthy pattern of global integration. It's not a fragmentation. It's a different pattern of integration that we're seeing that isn't necessarily growth enhancing. And not all patterns of globalization are the same. So it is not just about disrupting some of these networks, but it's about creating something new. That is an active decision. That is not something that's just going to emerge. That's difficult, and especially in the current climate.
So I have one question here on Indonesia, and then I'm going to ask you both a concluding question. But on Indonesia, could you just unpack a little more in the report? You know, we've talked about South Korea, we've talked about Brazil. We haven't focused as much on Indonesia, the critical minerals, and why it's so likely of all the three case studies, they will be as more removed than anyone else from some of the economic statecraft fallout.
Yeah, you would think that Indonesia, with some of their security, you know, tensions with China, would actually be more amenable to, you know, breaking with China economically. But first, you have a, you know, because of the tensions in the South China Sea, but you have this very recent and very intensive pattern of investment in Indonesia's minerals industries, particularly in nickel, and that those patterns are likely to, you know, really extend over time. Indonesia doesn't have a stated policy of sort of, you know, I forget exactly the phrase, but it's non-alignment and non-interference with in thinking about the Taiwan scenario. They don't consider this really a core political interest at that point. So it's hard for them to sort of, you know, I think it'd be very difficult to create a scenario in which the economic costs to of potentially breaking from sort of the Chinese position are that severe. It would be maybe there in some of the more extreme hardline scenarios, but otherwise the investment relationships, the geographic proximity that we speak about in the report, become a lot more central to that calculation. It is not that the security interests are by the wayside or ignored. It's just that there's always going to be contestation between these objectives, and it's not at all obvious exactly how that shakes out, depending upon, again, depends on how you get into the scenario and how you think about it. You can get a lot more quiet compliance with some of the other provisions than overt.
In Indonesia, another country with a new leader attending the
Yes,
G20
exactly.
summit next week, so new faces around the table. Emily, let me turn to you as we conclude. I think it's fair to say, certainly from the Atlantic Council side, and you can tell me from CNES, that we're not going to stop doing work in this area. What are the questions in your mind going forward still to answer? We set out this research agenda, G7 response, G20. What's next for you if we were to jointly do more in this area?
It's a great question, and I think, there's a lot of threads that I think we need to continue to pull out. I would say from the CNAS perspective, and I think for all of us, the more we can continue to build out, particularly some of the gaming and the scenario-based work around this, I think that's going to be hugely important. There's limits to that type of analytic work. There's, the games can only tell you so much. But I do think because this particular field is less mature than other areas of strategic planning, we really need to build that muscle. And the value in those sorts of games is just the iteration of it, doing it a bunch of times, testing a bunch of different theories, testing it with a bunch of different players and groups, and getting the private sector in. Understanding private sector decision-making and market participant decision-making in this is going to be really, really important. And so I think whether it's continued research interviews or I do like the gaming work for that, I think that building that body of work is going to be incredibly important. But then it can't stop there. I think we need to spend a lot of time maturing the what we call the economic domain aspect of this problem, but eventually you need to link it back up to the other domains, right? I think we would all agree that sanctions are just one tool. It's always going to be like part of an overall foreign policy response, and that is true. But how do we operationalize that in a much more meaningful way, both in terms of the research community, but also within our government and then across governments? I think some of that work happened by necessity in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I think some of it is kind of sort of happening right now as they're trying to think forward to potential China crises or conflicts. And if there's a recommendation that I would have coming out of all of our combined work on this for the incoming administration, the incoming Congress, it's to take this seriously. I think they do take it seriously and really think about this idea of integrated deterrence. I know that was something we talked a lot about in the Biden administration, but generally speaking, I think the idea still holds that we want to think about how all of our instruments of national power can be used to deter China from acts of aggression against its neighbors or other acts that are against U.S. security interests, right? That's the basic idea. And how do we get these things to work together? How do we think about the different timelines on this? We talked about how we are keeping a lot of our work kind of in a pre-kinetic context. But I think that implies that there's a sequencing question here of how much do you do now in this extended deterrence period that we're already in? How do you lean on the economic tools at this point? And at what point is there a handoff, right? Or how do you think about if your overarching objective is to degrade China's military capacity, what are the different tools that you have to do that, not just economic? And so I think ultimately, the work that we've been doing in our programs is to, again, mature the economic domain aspect of this, but eventually it's got to come back up, and it really has to be institutionalized within the government strategic planning process to make sure that we are thinking ahead, we're doing the contingency planning, we're thinking about impacts in other countries, we're building the toolkit for response, not just for other countries, but in the United States, right? You mentioned the Fed, right? So I think there's just a whole suite of work that still remains to be done.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think there was so much work we all had to do to get the economics closer up to par in the security dimension, where there's so much wargaming and scenario planning going on, and we do far less of that traditionally in the economic domain. But now that we've done it, it is time to integrate the work, because this is how this would play out in a real-world scenario. And even from a government inside USG perspective, getting folks at the Treasury to sit down with folks at the Pentagon, that kind of thing happens far too rarely. Better than it did a few years ago. There's progress, but there's a lot more to do, and we can jointly do it together. Logan, on your end, what report do you want to do next?
I think the part that's missing here are, pushing the, trying to make the Sisyphean boulder a little bit smaller as we push it up the hill one more time in this regard, is the element of timing, which has sort of been discussed, and trying to get a framing of risk that is going to adapt to a different set of conditions 5 to 10 years from now. And what I mean by that is when people talk about, we can all very easily say with absolute confidence, risks from over a China-Taiwan conflict and risks of economic costs of that have risen over the last 5 years. We can say that very distinctly. But what are we really talking about? We're actually talking about 3 different things, in my view, and those will develop differently over the next 5 to 10 years and should impact how we actually think about the scenarios now. If we are thinking in the world of escalating costs and escalating risks, we will always think that the costliest measures now will make more sense because it's about averting those costs in the future. But in reality, I think those risks will develop differently. For example, military and security risks from China's military modernization likely continue to increase. Technological and industrial competitiveness risks from China may increase for a while, may decline over time, probably stay about stable, roughly, and this is where export controls and semiconductor controls have been targeted. But the risks of China as a fundamental threat to liberal democratic systems via the growth of their economy, that China will eventually supplant the rest of the world, that is going to fade over time. That is a very different risk than in the future. And so how you think about the changing composition of those risks and how it impacts the other 2 is, I think, under-theorized. And that's the next report I would definitely like to get into, because it's only when we should be thinking about how to take the kind of steps to mitigate the first 2 risks at lowest costs, knowing that over time, a lot of these measures will become less costly rather than more.
Okay, I'm in for that.
Yep.
Let's do it. Logan, Emily, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the continued partnership and collaboration on this work, and we look forward to more going forward. Thank you to Rhodium Group for the partnership on this project and the 2 previous ones. I want to thank everyone from the teams of the Rhodium Group and the Atlantic Council, especially Jesse Yin on our team here at the GeoEconomics Center that made this report possible. There's so much research and work that goes on behind the scenes to produce this. We do it because we think it's important. We do it because we think it adds to the conversation, and we welcome your feedback on this work. Please stay with us at the Atlantic Council, at CNAS, and across our work in this area as we continue to chart what unfolds in the next administration, how it impacts US-China bilateral relations, how it impacts the global economy, and how it impacts national security. Thank you for being with us today. We wish everyone a good rest of the day.